in this video we're going to be looking at support, structure, and movement. Kind of a catch-all, but they're all really linked together. So we'll start by talking about the integumentary system, which is essentially the skin. The purpose of this system is to protect the organism, to provide a separation for it from its outside world. The outermost layer of this is called the epidermis, and this is found in most animals. The epidermis is like a tough outer layer, and the epidermis can produce several structures depending on the type of animal. For some animals, they produce what's called a cuticle. A cuticle is basically a non-living kind of coating that is produced. Some invertebrates secrete this to add protection for themselves. Like an exoskeleton is basically a secretion of the epidermis. A shell is an example of this for molluscs, and so that is an example of a cuticle. The exoskeleton is an example of support, our skeletal system, which we'll talk about in a second. Also, the epidermis produces a protein called keratin, and this kind of shows a hair fiber being broken down to its literal smallest bit ever. All right, and so why would it do that? Well, okay, keratin is the protein that makes up hair. It is a tough protein that, for our own cells, our outer layer of skin is just completely keratinized, but it also makes our fingernails, makes hair, causes those cells to harden, kind of gives a protective covering. And another thing that's important in animals for a couple of reasons is the production of pigments. And so pigments obviously give color. These are proteins that allow there to be all sorts of color. Color is typically used for one or two reasons in the animal kingdom. It could be used for warning coloration, or it could be used for camouflage. Sometimes you'll see organisms that are able to do both. There is other reasons for pigmentation, like UV protection, which is what our own pigmentation does. But for the most part, you see a lot of this in like warning coloration, like you might see here, or camouflage. Let's look at the skeletal system. There's a picture of a human skeleton, but it's not necessarily talking about human skeletons. The purpose of the skeletal system is for structure and protection. But there are different kinds of skeletal systems. So one example of this is something called a hydrostatic skeleton. A hydrostatic skeleton, or a hydroskeleton, is where the body fluids contribute to the rigidity of the skeleton. So if you've ever picked up a worm and it felt rigid, it's not because there's bone in there or really even strong muscles. It's just because it kind of presses its body out. It almost flexes. And that flexing kind of makes that worm rigid, but it's just water, or it's just fluid in there. It can also help with movement as well. There are rigid skeletons. This is probably what we're more familiar with. And so you have the exoskeleton, which is rigid, but it is on the outside. Insects have an exoskeleton. Most arthropods have an exoskeleton. Molluscs have a shell, which really doesn't count as an external skeleton, but for the purposes of protection and providing attachment, it's basically very similar. And then other animals have an endoskeleton, which is the skeleton itself is actual internal living tissue. And so a couple of things to note about the internal skeletons. Most vertebrates have an internal structure called a notochord. Only a couple animals have their notochord that persists into adulthood, but for vertebrates, the notochord kind of becomes part of the spine, but they still have their notochord present in larval stages or embryonic stages. Cartilage is a type of flexible skeleton. Some animals are completely composed of cartilage, like sharks, but for others, they retain some cartilage or lose a good portion of it as they age. And then lastly is bone. Bone is the most rigid of the skeletons. It's formed through mineral deposits in the bones. There are living cells inside bone, but it is mostly made of mineral deposits. And lastly, looking at this idea of movement, animals move lots of different ways, mostly achieved through a muscular system or some kind of contraction type cells not necessarily muscle cells, but any kind of cell that contracts. So the simplest kind of animals are just using really simple cells to move around, but most of them have some sort of cells that contract like a muscle. And so muscles are composed of fibers, and there are usually two types of fibers that you're going to see. Wow, that worked perfectly. I'm just going to do this and just lift in my Sunday shoes. So you have slow twitch muscles that are basically muscles that don't have a lot of fatigue, or that don't have a lot of fatigue because they have a whole lot of blood supply. You can see this here. They're aerobic. Think of like a steady run, like kind of like a slow jog. Like this girl is going for a jog. She has lots of slow twitch muscle fibers, so she can jog a long way. Whereas this dude over here has mostly fast twitch muscle fibers, and these are typically anaerobic, meaning they don't have a lot of oxygen supply, they have less blood, but you get kind of more explosive power, but they fatigue easily. The quickest way to think about this is, so if you have a chicken, right, we're all familiar with chicken meat, and chickens can run forever. Their legs are the dark meat, lots of blood supply, aerobic, they can last forever. Whereas their breast muscles, since they don't fly and they only fly in short bursts, tend to be anaerobic. And so this is like the white meat, not as much of blood supply, big explosive muscles that fatigue very easily. So that's the difference there. The types of muscles, I'll move me to someplace else over here. All right, so you can see those guts. All right, three types of muscles. There's cardiac muscle fiber, which is found in the heart. This is involuntary. That means that you cannot choose to move your cardiac muscles, nor can you choose to move your smooth muscles, which are typically found in your innards. Like you can see these innards here, they kind of help move food through the body as one example of that, or they can be found in blood vessels also. And then lastly are the skeletal muscles. They are attached to the skeleton, and they are typically voluntary muscles, meaning that you can choose to move those muscles.